So we're coming off of our discussion of criterion or the criteria, which is basically a blanket term for organizational outcomes at the individual level. So what are we interested in measuring to determine if someone is actually successful at their job? Very similarly, but not necessarily exactly the same, is the process of performance appraisal. So measuring performance generally is the criterion, but at this point we're flipping the script slightly because when we're looking at performance appraisal as a criterion or a criteria, we're mainly looking at it as far as how do we actually accurately measure it, specifically usually for purposes of validation and decision making. When we talk about performance appraisal, we're going to continue talking about methodology and basically best practices and best science in measuring performance, but we're also expanding it to a more of a human resources or an HR viewpoint of how do we use performance appraisal to provide feedback and to provide information to employees on how they're doing and how they could improve. So we're kind of expanding the scope, if you will, to not just be a methodological decision making or a statistical validation technique, but also the application of the performance appraisal to the real world. Now, normally I would have a video ready to play, but honestly, I haven't quite figured out how to do videos in videos. But I am it's always amused me that for as popular as IO psychology is, and it is a growing field. It often makes the top 5 lists of occupations that are best return on your investment. Most organizations recognize now what IO psychology is, and most major organizations have IO psychologists working within them. So it's a fairly high profile field in the corporate world, and it's a fairly high profile field in the world of psychology. However, it is very rare to find any movie that actually features IO psychologists, and usually when they do, they're not presented in the best light. So if you've ever watched Office Space, the Bobs are IO psychologists. So performance appraisal. The process of evaluating how effectively people are performing their jobs. Determining the reasons for evaluating that performance are the first thing we need to do. So the process of performance appraisal is simply trying to measure effectiveness. So we are trying to measure individual differences in people. That's where psychology really comes in. That is one of the major tenets of psychology, is how do we actually define and measure traits, states, opinions, beliefs, and even mental processes in individuals in order to predict their behavior, in order to understand what their behaviors are, and also often to be able to provide interventions or training. So if we're measuring job performance, the first question we want to ask is, why are we measuring it? Are we measuring it for developmental purposes, administrative decisions, or research? All 3 of these are valid in organizations. Most of the time, we're probably going to be using them effectively at some point for all 3. But if there's a stronger focus on one or the other, it may change the tools or methods that we can use to measure job performance. For example, probably one of the strongest tools we can use for developmental performance appraisal, the 360-degree feedback system, which we will be discussing in this lecture set, actually works wonderful for development, but falls apart if people know that you're making administrative decisions. And that's because it's reliant on peers and your own self-feedback. So if people know that that system is not going to be used for administrative decisions, they tend to be fairly honest about their own performance, and they tend to be pretty honest about their peers' performance. However, if they know that feedback system that requires them to rate themselves and to rate their coworkers, their fellows, are going to be used to determine which one of them gets a promotion, which one of them gets a bonus, which one of them gets promoted, guess what? They tend to start being less honest in their ratings. They tend to exaggerate their own performance, and they also tend to not necessarily sandbag or attack their coworkers, but rate their coworkers lower. So this is an example of knowing the reason for performance appraisal may also tell you which tools you can be using, or combination of tools. So for instance, if you are using 360-degree feedback, one of the first things I would suggest is make it very clear it should only be used for developmental. And if there is going to be administrative decisions, there needs to be some other system that is being used for those decisions, and people should be well informed of the difference in the 2. So again, developmental simply means that we're using performance appraisal to help develop employees. We're trying to let them know what they can do better and how they can improve. Administrative decisions are beyond that developmental feedback. We also are going to be using that performance appraisal to make decisions. Who gets training? Who may be put on warning? Who may actually be terminated? Who may actually be promoted? Who may actually get specific special functions or special tasks or projects? Any decision making based on performance appraisal also kind of determines what type of appraisal we should be using. And finally, research is not necessarily academic research. This refers to within organizational research. So are those performance appraisals going to also be used beyond the individual? Are they going to be used to maybe identify top performing units, bottom performing units? Are they going to be used to look for potential gaps in the skill sets across the company? And are they going to be used to help validate selection techniques? Again, if they're being used for that, that again tells us a different kind of information that we might need. Specifically, we need to make sure it's highly validated and that it is very accurate measure of performance if we're actually using it for validation purposes to determine what selectors are best. So the goals of performance appraisal can be many. And though there's three primary functions we just talked about, developmental, decision making, and research, we also need to recognize that there's additional goals to the process of performance appraisal. So one of them is strategic, linking employees' functions to the organizational mission and goals. So this is kind of a broad package of, are those performance appraisals, the performance that we're measuring, truly linked to the organization's mission and goals? And are they truly linked to the employee's function through job analysis? In other words, a part of the performance appraisal is another link in trying to create a strategic plan that goes from the top down, the goals, bottom up, the actual job roles, job analysis, and then the individual's function within those goals and within their job roles. Communication. So allowing people the ability to find out how well they're doing, to kind of pull back the curtains on the process of a performance appraisal and let people know how they're performing, where they're performing well, and what areas they might want to work on, especially as they're being perceived by their employers. Now recognize that also performance appraisal is almost always going to include some subjective opinions of either managers, peers, or even customers or direct reports. And therefore, a part of any performance appraisal is the perception of that person's appraisal or performance. So it's important when you're communicating performance appraisal that you also acknowledge that this may be a perceptual issue. In other words, the person may be doing well at this particular task, however, they're being perceived as not being doing well. And that also can be useful information if communicated properly. So often a comment that is used in pretty much almost all fields of psychology is perception is reality. And I'm not a big fan of that because actually reality is reality. But perception is reality reminds us that we could be doing everything right, but if no one sees it that way, if no one understands what we're doing and everyone thinks we're doing wrong, that perception can become more important than reality. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in all aspects of your life, that it's not just about what's actually happening, it's also about what's being perceived as happening. So of course it can be used for employment decisions and predictions, promotions, transfers, training, termination, discipline, merit recognition. All of these are valid uses for performance appraisal and one of the goals of performance appraisal. If you're never making any decisions off performance appraisal, that doesn't mean that you're not doing it, and it still may be developmental. But generally speaking, we do, as IO psychologists, want to push organizations into recognizing if they do have an appropriate and good performance appraisal system, that their decisions will be better if they're based on that system. So again, the results of the performance appraisal, that broadly top performers versus bottom performers, who's performing well, who's not performing well, all of those can then be used to actually validate criteria and also to validate selection tests. And we already kind of talked about developmental, but developmental also is not just about telling people what they're doing well and poorly. It's about giving employees solid feedback. It's about building that organizational viewpoint, actually building trust, building communication between management and direct reports, supervisors, but also identifying training needs and also looking across individuals. Are there developmental needs for the organization? And finally, let's not actually discount the fact that if certain decisions are made, specifically discipline and termination, that it might be very useful to have a documentation of the performance, a record of these HR decisions. Now, this is not a legal requirement for everyone. Once again, remember that the base law of employment is employment at will, which means that barring any other legislation, any organization has the right to hire or fire at will. And you have the right to work or not work at will. However, there are laws that specifically focus on employment decisions for protected groups. And therefore, generally speaking, most organizations have moved away from the reality of employment at will to more of a just cause model for all employees. And this is not necessarily a bad thing in any way, shape, or form. I'm simply making you aware that that is a decision they have made for many of their employees, because many other employees would not necessarily have an actual legal requirement for you to document prior to discipline or termination. But due to the fact that a fair amount of workers may be protected by various laws, most organizations have moved to, again, a just cause model. That is a choice they've made. And that just cause model means that they're treating all their employees the same, equally. And that is also a good thing, honestly. So therefore, performance appraisal, and a good performance appraisal backed by job analysis and has been shown to be a predictor of who is performing well and poorly in an organization, is a very vital component to have if you do have to terminate or discipline an employee, because you can document that performance and prove it in a court of law. So the realities of performance appraisals, however, is appraisal does happen in all organizations, whether they have a system or not. In other words, people are going to get praised for good performance. People are going to be disciplined in some form for poor performance. Some people are going to be promoted. Some people are going to get bonuses. Some people are going to be terminated. The question is how scientific and how practical, based on IO good practice, is that performance appraisal? Recognize that therefore appraisals do have personal and organizational consequences regardless of the system. And as job complexity increases, accuracy with the ratings become more difficult, and honestly also a composite score becomes more questionable. The more complex the job is, the more various aspects someone may do well at and some may do poorly at, and really you have to start to ask, what are the core concepts? So for example, you may have a medical doctor who has horrible bedside manner, does not know how to relate to patients in any way, shape, or form, and by many ratings may be considered a very poor doctor. However, they're the only person that knows how to do a particularly extremely complex and life-saving surgery. So again, that aspect of their job might trump any of the other ratings that they get. However, when we create a composite score that treats all those ratings equally, they may be actually rated very low, even though they may be the most important employee at a hospital due to the fact of their unique skill and potentially the money they bring in with that unique skill. So just recognize, as a job becomes more complex, it does become harder and harder to be able to truly and accurately reflect that performance with a single score. Recognize that appraisals are inherently political. When we talk about politics within organizations, you're going to hear the term a lot. It's politics. What we refer to in organizations as politics is behaviors that are not necessarily focused on the organizational goals. In other words, and maybe this is an outside judgment call, but politics in organizations are almost always a negative thing. We do not want political acts within an organization, because political acts within an organization are defined as those acts that are self-serving and are not functioning or serving the organizational goals or the job that the person is supposed to be doing. However, we're human. So when people are being appraised, they know they're being appraised for potential bonuses, for potential raises, for potential promotion. And therefore, they're going to tend to want to do things to increase the likelihood of them getting high ratings. That's a political act. When managers or supervisors are rating people, especially subjective ratings, they of course are probably not going to be completely able to separate themselves from who they like, who they dislike, who they'd like to see promoted, and who they wouldn't, which makes it harder for them to attend to the actual ratings of how the person is doing. So bias will be a part of the system. But here's where I want to make a very strong point. it will be a greater part of the system if there isn't a systematically well-designed performance appraisal system. So again, performance appraisal, whether it's an actual system or whether it's someone just making calls in an office somewhere, is happening. It is having organizational consequences, and it is very difficult the more complex the job. And no matter what we do, there will be some bias and some political acts. But if you remove a system that tries to quantify performance based on job analysis and organizational goals, this political problem becomes much worse. Finally, the reality of performance appraisals, and this is the greatest challenge, is implementation and administration requires time and effort and must be believed and endorsed by both the employees and the supervisors. In other words, if an organization truly wants to have accurate performance appraisal, they have to devote time and training to those doing the appraisals, supervisors. They need to communicate to the supervisors why this is important. The supervisors need to be given time to do these tasks, and the supervisors need to be trained and given time to actually spend quality time giving this feedback to the employees. The employees also need to be given time to get this feedback, to be a part of the process, and to potentially be trained or at least clearly communicated to what the process is, why we're believing in it, why it's supported, and how we're going to use it within an organization. So there's a lot of tasks here. You have to recognize that the attack on performance appraisals, whether political, is accurate, but it gets worse the less systematic performance appraisal you have. And to get to systematic performance appraisal, we have to sell it to an organization, we have to sell it to the supervisors using it, and we have to sell it to the employees as well. So let's briefly talk about the types of rating formats that we can use. So we're actually moving specifically to the operations of measuring performance. And there's basically kind of four broad categories. The first one is graphic rating scales. And we're very familiar with graphic rating scales because it's basically an interval Likert-like scale. It is a scale with a midpoint, typically, a low end, and a high end. And it's usually going to be numerical, maybe a 1 to 4 scale, 1 to 5 scale, 1 to 7 scale. And at that point, we're then going to have effectively equal intervals. So for example, I've got one here to the right. We have below expectations, meets expectations, exceeds expectations. A couple of notes on graphic rating scales. One, the scale itself is fairly simplistic and fairly easy to create. There is some debate on how many numbers and whether they should be odd or even. And let me address that briefly. Generally speaking, and remember cognitive psychology, we actually have a bottleneck in our short-term memory of basically 7 plus or minus 2, which means most people can keep about 5 to 9 concepts or structures in their actual short-term memory, in their operating memory at any time. So that kind of gives us a little bit of information. A lot of people want to put more and more numbers in graphic rating scales, figuring the more numbers, the more fine-tuned the scale. This actually tends to fall apart cognitively. Broadly speaking, we want no more than 9 points on any scale, and even that may challenge some people. I would suggest a 1 to 5, basically a 1 to 4, 1 to 5, 1 to 6, or 1 to 7 scale, depending on what you're trying to do. I wouldn't go over 7. And in fact, psychometrically, and that's the study of people's responses on measures, finds that generally when we go to 9 items or more, we start to get bimodal distributions. Because what people are doing is they first do a rule of thumb of are they on the top of the scale or the bottom of the scale. And then once they make that decision, they rate them within that scale, which means we tend to have very few people being rated at the midpoint, because the midpoint then becomes either the very highest rating of the bottom of the scale or the very lowest rating of the top of the scale. So if we want to maintain normal distributions, I would suggest not going over a graphic rating scale higher than 7. Now the next question is what's the lowest you should go? I would say no lower than 4. And the reason for this is that we tend to find that when we go below 4, 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, it's starting to become more categorical, and people respond to it more categorically. We start to find, again, problems with normal distributions. At about 4 or greater, we tend to find people are starting to kind of treat 1, 2, 3, and 4 as equally distant and tend to respond in normal distributions. So that kind of gives us some information that if we're wanting to actually get a good measure of performance, we want a 4 to 7 scale. Now the next question is odds or even. And this has been debated a lot in psychometrics. The biggest question is that if you are worried about people not responding honestly, if you're worried about people not taking the time on this scale, giving them a midpoint gives them a way out. In other words, if they're not sure about someone, they can just go with the midpoint, meets expectations. They can just go with neutral. They can just go with average. And we tend to find that, especially in people that are not necessarily highly engaged in the rating, that's what happens, a lot of midpoint choice. And that's why some people will go with even numbers, 4 or 6. It makes you have to go at least slightly above average or at least slightly below average, and it makes people engage a little bit more. Now, again, the downside is that if the answer truly is they are in the middle, they aren't exceptional in any way, but they also aren't failing in any way. We've taken that option away with an even scale. So there is no right answer here. I would say, though, that you at least want to come into it with an open mind and have an understanding of the differences between an even versus odd number of items on a graphic rating scale. The final thing I'm going to say on a graphic rating scale is that the question design becomes a little difficult. You need to make sure that each question that is responded to with a graphic rating scale is logically answerable by that scale and is only asking a single question. So if you have any items that seem to answer double-barreled or have 2 questions or could be interpreted in multiple ways, you need to break them up. The whole idea behind graphic rating scales is simple items, clearly understood, that match the actual graphic rating scales options. So below expectations, meet expectations, exceeds expectations. What if you asked a question that isn't about expectations? That's the problem. You need to make sure that every question is about expectations if this is your response scale. I'm going to skip over behaviorally anchored rating scales and go to the other ones and then come back. Mainly because behavior anchored rating scales are a little more complex and have more process into creating. So other than graphic rating scales, the next one are checklists. So checklists are simply did or they did not do the behavior. So you list a series of behaviors, usually drawn from a job analysis, that are associated with job performance, and the person simply either chooses whether they did it or not. So they check yes for each yes, and if it's a no, they don't check it. A lot of times these scales will secretly or behind the scenes be weighted. In other words, some boxes need to be checked and are major parts of whether or not the person is performing. Some boxes might be less. So for example, if you were doing a job where your primary task is actually writing reports with no errors, that box might be worth 10 points. While a box that asks, are you pleasant to work with, is worth 2 points. Now the person rating this would probably not know the weighting of the scale, but they could probably also figure it out if they were thinking about it. Some people argue that the problem with checklists is they're too transparent and it's too easy for a manager or a supervisor in a single glance to really get an idea of how they should check someone if they want them to get high ratings and how they should not check someone if they want them to get low ratings, which means that they may be more potential to bias in politics. One of the answers to this is forced choice checklist. Now, generally, this is a psychometric answer, but a lot of managers and supervisors don't like these checklists. It basically means that for every single box, there's 2 boxes and they have to choose one. So and sometimes they'll both be negative and sometimes they'll both be positive. And the idea here is that they're forcing you to at least acknowledge that some people may have failings in some areas. In other words, if they had to work on one of these things, which one would they have to work with? That might be a first choice negative. So again, they usually require more effort by the supervisor. They're usually not liked by supervisors, especially if both of the items really don't reflect the employee. Let's say there are 2 positive items and this employee does neither of those. You still have to check one. The advantages here, though, is they're a little less likely to be susceptible to bias in politics. And also, they do force the person doing the ratings to think a lot more closely about how they're rating the person. And finally, we have just employee comparison procedures, and this is a broad category. Employee comparison procedures can also include, again, no system, where you just have a supervisor deciding who actually is going to be promoted, who's going to be terminated, etc. But when we talk about employee comparison procedures as a specific format of performance appraisal, we're at least talking about a procedure. And usually those might be either rank ordering or paired comparisons. So rank ordering means that the manager, based on hopefully a fair amount of observations and data, is going to rank order all of their direct reports from the very best to the very worst. And no one can tie. So they have to put someone at number one, they have to put someone at number two, and so on. Now they can make notes that the fact that the very bottom ranked person is still performing well, but it makes them do rank ordering. And this often may also be a system that is quickly put in place when a decision needs to be made quickly. Who's going to get the promotion? And instead of just having the manager have to say, well, I like this person, let's promote them, it at least makes them think through the process. If I truly had to rank order my employees from best to worst, what would that ranking be? This may also work well if a group of employees are going to get a bonus. The other possibility is paired comparisons, and this is often kind of similar to a paired bracket in sports. Basically, randomly, you pair all of your direct reports, and then you ask, of those two, which is the better employee? And then once you have that bracket or advancement, you then make an additional comparison until you have ranks of people that fell out in the first rank, second rank, third rank, all the way to the person who quote unquote won the paired rankings. Okay, so let's go back to the behavior anchored rating scale, BARS. This was actually a technique that was designed by IO psychologists to try to get around a lot of the problems that we found in all these other methods. And the idea behind a behaviorally anchored rating scale is that it's still some form of graphic rating scale. It usually is going to have numbers. Again, I would suggest no more than 9. But each number is going to be clearly defined, and each number is going to be different for each question. So again, if we're doing graphic rating scales, we might have 7 measures of performance, and for each one, you rate below expectation to exceeds expectation. If we were doing behavior anchored rating scales for those same items, everyone would have a behavior anchored rating scale, and each one would be a very different set of descriptors. None of them would say meet or exceed or below expectations. They would specifically list what behaviors are a 2, what behaviors are a 3, what behaviors are a 5, what behaviors are an 8, what behaviors are a 9, going from poor performance to good performance. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to walk through the process of creating a behavioral anchored rating scale. So this is a time-consuming and expensive process, kind of similar to job analysis, and it has to be done for every single item that's going to be used. So first step is to actually identify subject matter experts and define several dimensions that are important for the job. So hopefully using a job analysis, we're going to determine what are the things that we need to measure in this particular job to truly capture performance. They may be 5 items, they may be 7 items, they may be 15 items. And then for each one of those, we're going to have to create a scale. And that subject matter expert group is identifying. So that first group, their job is to figure out what needs to be measured. Generally speaking, step 2 would be a separate group of subject matter experts, probably those that actually supervise the job or do the job, create a series of behavior examples using a critical incident technique. So again, this is going to be probably large focus groups of people that have the job or supervisors that manage the job, where they're going to be create critical incidents. They're going to be creating, here was the behavior, here is the context of the behavior, here is the outcome of the behavior, and here is why it was good or bad. So they're going to create these for every one of those actual dimensions of performance. And they're going to have to create a fair amount of them, because the goal then is from this pool to sort through those critical incidents into the appropriate dimensions, and then also rate those performance examples on effectiveness. So basically, once you have a whole bunch of critical incidents, you're going to make sure the critical incidents for each particular performance measure are appropriate. In other words, someone might come up with a great critical incident while thinking about conscientiousness in performance, but it actually is a better measure of task focus. So you might move that over. So that's part of step 3, is, are any of these critical incidents in the wrong category? Once you're sure they're all in the right category, you're then going to actually go to step 4, which is you're going to rate them from the very best example of performance to the very worst. So you're going to then have a big pool in step 4 of appropriate critical incidents for each performance dimension, ranked from very best to very worst. Step 5 is, again, those subject matter experts, with the direction of probably an IO psychologist and facilitators, are going to figure out what are the ones that they want on the scale. Because hopefully you'll have a bunch of items, and you're probably wanting, on a 9-point scale, no more than 9. And honestly, sometimes even a 9-point scale may have 5 or 6 at strategic locations. So the goal of a behavioral anchored rating scale is now there is no there's no wiggle room for bias, personal opinion, or politics on what exactly is failing to meet expectations. What is meeting expectations? What is exceeding expectations? Because there's very specific examples. So if you can't defend that you're seeing those examples of behavior in a person that you're evaluating with performance appraisal as a supervisor, you shouldn't give that rating. So BARS is a very methodologically sound system. Generally, there is less room for bias and politics, though people could always just ignore the anchors. We generally find that the ratings become a little bit more accurate. However, for the large amount of work that it takes, the improvements are fairly small when we compare them to just, for example, graphic rating scales. And also, they tend to be very tied to the job as it exists today, which also means if that job changes in a couple years, you'll need to not only do a new job analysis, you'll probably need to develop a new system of BARS. So this is kind of the gold standard for measure of performance, and I would say that from a scientific viewpoint, from a psychometric viewpoint, this is what we should do. But it is hard to sometimes argue, especially if an organization is resisting, that it is worth the money, the time, and the effort compared to simply a well-designed graphic rating scale, for instance. So we have the advantages and disadvantages of these various formats. Graphic rating scales, they're easy to develop and use. However, they tend to lack precision in dimensions, and they also lack precision in anchors. So a lot of times they also are a little bit harder to use for developmental purposes. So you gave me a 3 on a 6-point scale. Why? That isn't in the scale. That requires conversation. BARS, the advantages here are very precise, well-defined anchors, well received by raters and ratees once they're designed. In fact, they're usually the people involved in actually doing the job and supervising the job are often those that actually designed the scale. The disadvantage, time and money, it is intensive. And also, there's no strong evidence that you actually get at a superior accuracy. And by superior accuracy is the graphic rating scales tend to be fairly good at identifying truly top performers and identifying truly bottom performers, about at the same rate that BARS are. So if you're really looking at, it is precise and it's a little better in the middle, but as far as top and bottom performers, which is often what we're really looking for when we're doing performance appraisal, there's not a whole lot of difference. Checklists, easy to develop and use. However, rater errors tend to be frequent, and if you actually take steps to remove those rater errors, it tends to be harder to develop and also less responded to positively by both those being rated and those rating. And of course, employee comparison methods do give you precise rankings, useful for administrative rewards on a limited basis. However, again, if they're done right, they are fairly time intensive by the supervisors using them, and generally they're not well received as far as perceptions of justice. So exactly why was I the very first ranked person? Or you said I just missed getting the promotion, but what was I rated on? So again, both the ratees and raters, and also even legally defensible, this is a little more questionable.